What you had was an organisation which comprised with some ex-IRA people, some you describe as revolutionaries, some could be described as anarchists, who formed this organisation called Serera.
There were paramilitaries, they were subversive, they robbed banks, apparently they kept some money for themselves. They put a lot of planning into their operations, and they were very volatile, very violent.
Serera claimed they wanted to ignite a socialist revolution by attacking the establishment. This would be achieved by robbing banks and using the proceeds to somehow encourage workers and small farmers to overthrow the government and capitalism in Ireland.
The point at which you begin to see the gun emerging in society down here is when it became used in armed raids. And if you're a self-professed socialist, which many of them were, they had the added incentive of saying they were taking it from the capitalist system or from the financial institutions of the capitalist system, so all that was good.
Almost 2 years before the outbreak of the Troubles, Serera struck their first blow for a socialist republic in Drumcondra on Dublin's north side. The date was February the 27th, 1967. The occasion was the first armed robbery of a bank since World War II. That day, Serera gunmen entered these premises and stole £3,265. In today's money, that was worth over €100,000. A tidy sum to start a revolution. A year later in Ballyfermot, these so-called revolutionaries also revealed that they were reckless. When spotted by a squad car on the way to a raid, they opened up on the unarmed policemen pursuing them.
We spotted a stolen car with 4 men in it outside a bank. They were about to rob the bank. A chase ensued. One of the raiders put his head and shoulders out one of the back windows of the car, and he fired a number of shots directly at the patrol car. We dived down in the car, and actually the driver had nowhere to dive. He had to keep down as best he could, and he swerved the car from left to right to avoid the gunfire.
The leading lights of this faction are forgotten now. Men like Sean Doyle, Martin Casey, Paddy Dillon and Frank Keane.
They were supposed to be political. Now, I'd put that in inverted commas, like lots of robberies that were carried out after that. Every robbery that was happened through the 70s and 80s, there'd be one of the gang trying to speak with a northern accent and claiming it was political.
Serera was connected to Dublin's emerging underworld. Among their membership was a man who would in time become the godfather of Ireland's first major organised crime gang, the Duns. That man was a charismatic character called Christy Bronco Dunn, the eldest of 22 children from Crumlin in Dublin. It was this career criminal who used his English gangland contacts to provide Serera with some of its arsenal of guns. The weapons were stolen from a firearms factory in Birmingham. Bronco was to blaze a trail that other gangsters would soon follow.
First time that he came to prominence as being a political figure was after there was a man named Walsh blown up on the railway line. He was a member of Serera up near the Phoenix Park. And Christie made a bit of a speech at the GPO and fired a shot, if you don't mind. And then he was obviously accepted in as a member of Serera, and he was convicted in the district court. I think he got 6 months. He assaulted the judge at the time, so he was really making himself a figure, a leading figure in Serera at that time.
In February 1970, here in this town in Rathdrum, they took over this town, set up roadblocks, cut phone lines, fired shots over the Garda, and robbed the bank of £1,500. Now, this was an audacious, reckless operation, and it set minds thinking as to what this organisation would do next.
If it was a question that the forces of oppression did attempt to disarm or did attack a unit of Serera in operation, Serera would resist, has resisted, and will resist again.
These misfits are rarely mentioned in the story of organised crime in Ireland. Yet it was Serera who first brought the gun back onto the streets of Irish towns and terrified ordinary people working and doing business in banks and post offices. On April the 3rd, 1970, 4 Saor Éire volunteers set out to rob the branch of the Allied Irish Bank on Arran Quay in Dublin. This operation would be a defining moment in the history of serious crime in Ireland. The spate of raids on banks had led to heightened security. Banks now had alarms and the police were on alert. Garda Richard Fallon was on his way to work when Saor Éire entered a bank and stole £2,000.
It had been the usual morning, you know, he got up and shaved as usual. There was the bit of polishing of the buckles on his tunic, as they always did in those days with the older uniform. So he went out the door as usual that morning with a quick goodbye.
Richard Fallon, he was a senior guard in Mount Drive when I arrived there. He mentored younger personnel, and he told anybody, the whole unit that were there, that people should be careful on the street, and that in his case, that a Scott Medal awarded posthumously wouldn't be any good to his widow, which was, you know, prophetic.
The raiders, there were 4 of them, entered the bank shortly before 11 o'clock. Once inside, they pulled masks over their heads, drew guns, and ordered the 4 customers and 13 staff members to lie on the floor. But the manager of the bank, Mr. Stanley Keegan, spotted them from his office. He pressed a buzzer which rang an alarm in Dublin Castle and the Bridewell, so that when the raiders came out of the bank, a squad car pulled up outside.
This is the first time in my life I've ever walked down this lane. It's the lane that leads to the bank where my father was killed on the 3rd of April 1970. He'd gone to collect his car from being serviced, but they got the call in the squad car while he was being given a lift down, and he ended up here coming in the front gate of the bank right as the raiders came out the front door.
I heard shots which were fired either just at the door or outside the door.
The raiders were storming out the door. It's recounted that he raised his arm and was shot in the arm at that point.
I then saw a policeman chasing somebody along the lane here, and I heard a further shot, and I saw the policeman fall.
A fatal shot was delivered to him here. He died instantly on that spot there. And the guard who was with him, Paul Firth, said an act of contrition into his ear.
That sent shockwaves through everybody on the island of Ireland, I would say, at that particular time. A relatively small group of people terrorizing different towns in the state with their activity in terms of robbing banks, and in essence here, shooting down an unarmed member of the Garda Síochána carrying out his duty. We had really crossed the Rubicon, because now we are into the era of the gun.
This was unbelievable, that an unarmed member of the Garda Síochána would be shot dead in cold blood. And it really was the end of the age of innocence as far as policing and armed robberies and organised crime is concerned.
When all the public eye was taken away from it, we were, like all families, in a bereaved situation. You're on your own. And I remember going upstairs one day at that point and opening a cupboard on the landing, and some of my father's shoes were in the bottom, and I remember stepping into them, just trying to remember how big his feet were, and I could feel the imprints of his toes in the bottom of the shoe, and it kind of gave me a shiver, and and it was a sense that, yeah, they've taken him away from us. Dad isn't there anymore.
Once you introduce the gun into society, the guy with the gun now becomes the most powerful guy. And the guy with the gun doesn't abide by any conventional or civilized rules. He makes his own rules.
I think the fact that there was so much subversive crime, and because the subversive crime turned to things like bank robberies and so on, and the enrichment of those who were involved in it, it began to generate the feeling in the minds of other non-subversive people that they might as well take the benefit of it too. Ordinary crime then began to develop, if you like, in parallel with the subversive activities.
Re-enter Christy Dunn and his crime family of 8 brothers. This group would help nurture, sponsor, induct, recruit and train several individuals who would become major international crime figures over the next 30 years. Martin Cahill, the General. John Cunningham, the Colonel. George Mitchell, the Penguin. John Gilligan, the Warehouse Man. They and other outlaws all started their careers on heists, strokes and raids initiated by the Dunns.
I would have to take the responsibility for introducing serious crime into the family, only because I felt with my brothers that if we ever did do anything together, which we have done, that it was a close-kept secret between us. We worked together, we could depend on each other with our lives. And we knew that whatever we did, nobody else would ever know about it.
Larry and Vianney and Shamey and Christy, they all were into robberies. And they accumulated money through robberies, mainly jewellery robberies or cash or whatever they could get their hands on. Now, there'd be big jobs to be done. They wouldn't be doing small hold-ups. They were very violent. They certainly were into the upper echelons of crime, serious crime.
Their father, Christy Sr., was a bad fella in his own heyday. Old Bronco was an ex-con who had served prison time for killing a man. He was proud of his sons.
Were you aware that your sons were robbing banks?
I was, yes. Yes. And I quite admired them for it.
You admired them for robbing the banks?
Yes.
Why?
As long as nobody was hurt.
Why?
Well, they were getting money the handy way. No loss of life, no malicious damage or injuries to anybody.
But they're taking somebody else's money.
Yes, but who do you know whose money it is that's in the bank? How do them people get it?
In time, the Dunns would become the scourge of Irish society. By 1970, Christy, the eldest and the original self-appointed criminal godfather, had already earned his place in history for his involvement with the short-lived Sayre era. The revolutionaries who had fired the shots that marked the death knell of a way of life. From 1970 on, armed robbery, extortion, abductions, tiger kidnappings and murder would become commonplace. The chaotic 70s would create Ireland's first generation of criminal godfathers as crime gangs sought to imitate the paramilitaries. The state, distracted by divisions from within and attacks from without, failed to notice the looming menace of organised crime. The era of the bad fellas was upon us.